Story 1. The Forgotten House Outside Madison. The old house stood just outside of Madison, Wisconsin, for as long as anyone in the nearby town could remember. It had been the subject of whispered stories, legends told around campfires, and dares made by reckless teenagers. Most people in the town knew better than to get too close. The older folks warned us, speaking of strange disappearances, of odd happenings that couldn't be explained. Over time, the stories blended into myth, a tale to scare children from wandering too far from the beaten path. To Sam and me, however, it was the ultimate destination for an afternoon of adventure. We were 16, the perfect age for bad decisions, and that weekend was no different. It was a warm, early fall Saturday afternoon when Sam suggested we finally check out the house. "It's just sitting there," he said with that eager grin I knew so well. "No one's been in it for years. What if we're the ones to find something cool? Maybe treasure in the attic or something left behind in the basement." Sam was always the more adventurous of the two of us. I was content to play it safe most of the time, but something about the way he described it that day made my heart race with excitement. We had walked past the house a few times before, always debating whether to go in, but never actually doing it. But that Saturday, we decided to go for it. The house stood in a secluded area, set back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and tall grass. The driveway leading up to it was barely visible, cracked and worn from decades of neglect. It was a 2-story building, once grand, but now crumbling with age. The windows were dark, covered in grime, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of weathering. A swing hung crookedly from the porch ceiling, swaying gently in the breeze despite the stillness in the air. As we approached the front door, I felt a twinge of unease, but Sam seemed undeterred. He reached for the door handle, and to our surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of dust and decay. I hesitated for a moment, my heart beating faster. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, glancing at Sam. My voice sounded weak, uncertain. Sam gave me a confident grin, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "What's the worst that could happen?" he said with a wink before stepping inside. I followed reluctantly, my feet heavy, as if weighed down by invisible hands. The air inside the house was thick and musty, the kind of smell that clings to places long abandoned. We stepped further into the hallway, our footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floorboards. The house felt alive somehow, as if it had been waiting for us. The first thing we noticed was how quiet it was. The air felt stagnant, oppressive. There were no sounds from outside: the birds, the wind, all of it seemed muffled, like we had stepped into another world. The only noise was the sound of our own footsteps and the occasional groan of the old floor beneath our weight. The hallway stretched ahead of us, leading into the shadows of the house. We passed rooms on either side, the doors ajar, revealing empty spaces filled with dust-covered furniture. It was clear that no one had lived here for years. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards were warped, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten decorations. But as we reached the living room, something caught our attention. There, in the center of the room, stood a video camera on a tripod. It was completely out of place. The house had clearly been abandoned for decades, yet this camera was new. It was sleek, modern, and positioned in such a way that it was pointed directly at the far wall. A thick sheet had been laid out on the floor in front of it, covering an area large enough to suggest that something had been staged there. Sam and I exchanged nervous glances. "What the hell is this?" Sam muttered, his voice suddenly unsure. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I inspected the camera. My fingers hovered over the buttons. Part of me wanted to see what was on it, but the other part, the part that had been taught to leave well enough alone, screamed at me to get out of there. "Someone's been here recently," I whispered. "This can't have been left for long." I knelt down, pulling the sheet back slightly. My hands trembled as I revealed what lay beneath a dark stain, dried and crusted into the floorboards. It looked like blood. Jesus! I backed away quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. "We shouldn't be here, Sam." But Sam, ever the daredevil, couldn't resist. "Let's see what they were filming." His voice was tense but filled with curiosity. He pressed a button on the camera, and the small screen flickered to life. Grainy footage began to play, footage of the very room we were standing in. The camera was recording the empty space, its lens fixed on the far wall. And then something moved. A shadow, quick and fleeting, passed across the screen. Sam leaned in closer, squinting at the small monitor. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to speak. The footage continued to roll, the room remaining nearly empty for several seconds. And then the camera shook violently, as if it had been knocked over. The screen went black. Sam turned the camera off, his face pale. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Just as he said it, we heard the unmistakable sound of a door closing from somewhere upstairs. We froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. The noise was followed by another, a slow creak, as if someone was moving above us. The old house groaned with the weight of movement, but we hadn't seen anyone. Who or what was upstairs? "We need to leave," I whispered, my throat tight with fear. Sam nodded, and we backed toward the front door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But just as we reached the entrance, the door slammed shut in front of us with a deafening bang. We jumped, and I grabbed Sam's arm. "This isn't funny," I hissed, my voice shaking. "Someone's messing with us." "I didn't touch it," Sam said, his face pale. His bravado had vanished. "I swear." We turned to face the stairs. The creaking had stopped, but we could still feel it, that presence, heavy and unsettling, like we were being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. There was someone or something in the house with us. "I think we're locked in," Sam muttered, trying to open the door again. But it wouldn't budge. The lock was old, rusted shut, and we hadn't even realized it when we first walked in. "Let's try the back door," I whispered. But even as I said it, a gnawing doubt crept into my mind. Every horror story I had ever heard was flooding back. We were exactly where we shouldn't be, in a house that should have stayed forgotten. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a terrible mistake by coming here. We crept through the house, our footsteps barely audible over the sound of our own breathing. The back door was at the end of the hallway, but as we neared it, I felt my chest tighten. There, just in front of the door, was another sheet. Just like the one in the living room, it was laid out neatly on the floor, but this one had something underneath it. I could see the shape, a long, narrow figure hidden beneath the fabric. "What the hell?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling as he reached out to lift the edge of the sheet. "Don't," I hissed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Sam pulled the sheet back, and we both recoiled at the sight. Beneath the sheet was a mannequin, its face blank and featureless. It was dressed in tattered clothing, its body posed unnaturally, as if it had been arranged for some grotesque scene. But that wasn't the worst part. The mannequin's hands were covered in dried blood. I gagged, my stomach churning at the sight. "We need to go. Now." Sam didn't argue. We sprinted to the back door, but as soon as Sam touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. We backed away, our hearts pounding in unison. The whispers started again, this time louder, coming from every direction, echoing off the walls. The house was alive, and it didn't want us to leave. "We're trapped," Sam muttered, his voice filled with panic. "No, there has to be another way out," I insisted, but even as I said it, I could feel the walls closing in around us. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, moving with a life of their own. Then, from the top of the stairs, we heard it, a single soft creak, like a footstep. We turned, our eyes fixed on the staircase. And there at the top stood a figure. It was a man, or at least it had been. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, the fabric hanging off his bony frame like rags. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing yellowed teeth. He took a step forward, and the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that I could see my breath in front of me. "Get out," the man rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the hallway, but as we ran, the house seemed to shift around us. The walls closed in, the doors disappeared, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. We reached the living room, but the front door was gone, replaced by a solid wall of rotting wood. "We're trapped," Sam shouted, his voice filled with panic. I turned, searching for another way out, and my eyes landed on the window. It was our only chance. "Help me," I shouted, and together we pried the window open, the old wood splintering as we forced it wide enough to climb through. Sam went first, scrambling out onto the overgrown grass outside. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment we were both outside, the whispers stopped, and the house fell silent. We didn't look back. We ran as fast as we could, through the tall grass and the overgrown bushes, until we reached the safety of the road. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we turned to look at the house. It stood there, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But we knew better. We told our parents what had happened, but they didn't believe us. The police went to the house a few days later, but when they did, the camera was gone. The mannequin was gone, and there was no sign of the man we had seen. The house was torn down a few years later, but the memory of that day still haunts me. Sometimes when I'm alone, I can still hear the whispers, the faint echoes of a house that should have stayed forgotten. Story 2. The Hunter of Matanuska Valley. Alaska, known for its vast wilderness and unforgiving landscapes, hides many secrets beneath its icy surface. Stories of survival, death, and terror are woven into the very fabric of the state's history. But there's one story that most people have either forgotten or prefer not to remember: the story of Robert Hansen, the serial killer who stalked the streets of Anchorage and the remote wilderness beyond. I had heard about Hansen from a friend of mine who lived in Anchorage for years. He told me about the fear that gripped the city when the bodies began to surface, buried in shallow graves in the Matanuska Valley. Hansen, they said, wasn't like most serial killers. He didn't just murder his victims, he hunted them. He would release them into the woods, give them a head start, and then track them down like prey. When my friend told me this story, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the sheer horror of it. But there was more to the tale than just the man himself. The Matanuska Valley, where many of his victims were found, was said to be haunted by the souls of the women he killed. The valley was vast, desolate, and covered in thick forests that seemed to swallow everything whole. People said that on certain nights, if you listened closely, you could still hear the screams of Hansen's victims echoing through the trees. It wasn't until years later that I found myself in Alaska, working a temporary job in Anchorage. I had taken a position as a park ranger at the edge of the Matanuska Valley, mostly working to keep tourists safe from the harsh environment. The wilderness was as beautiful as it was dangerous, and many visitors underestimated just how quickly things could go wrong in a place like this. One evening, I was scheduled to do a routine patrol of the trails that ran along the outskirts of the valley. It was late September, and the days were already growing shorter. The sun dipped below the horizon earlier than expected, casting long shadows across the landscape. As I set out on my patrol, the air was crisp and cold, biting at my skin even beneath my thick jacket. The trees were beginning to shed their leaves, and the ground was littered with a thick carpet of reds and browns. I walked along the trail for a while, the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel, the only noise in the otherwise silent forest. The beauty of Alaska never failed to amaze me, even after all the stories I had heard about the darker side of the state. The isolation of the wilderness was intoxicating, and it was easy to see how someone could get lost out here, both physically and mentally. As I continued along the trail, the wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. I pulled my collar up higher around my neck, trying to keep out the cold. The trail was empty, as it often was this time of year. Most tourists had already headed south, leaving the valley to the locals and the few brave souls who dared to venture into the wilderness as the winter months approached. About an hour into my patrol, I reached a section of the trail that dipped down into a small ravine. The trees here were thicker, their branches intertwining above me like a canopy. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen as I descended into the ravine. There was something about this place that felt different off. The wind had died down, and the silence was oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I paused for a moment, listening. At first, there was nothing. Just the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant creak of a branch. But then I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the stillness of the forest. It was a scream distant, almost carried away by the wind. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening for it again, but the forest had fallen silent once more. I told myself it was just the wind. The wind could play tricks on your mind out here, especially when you were alone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had heard something, and it wasn't the wind. I continued down the trail, my senses on high alert. The deeper I went into the ravine, the darker it seemed to get, as if the trees themselves were closing in around me. I gripped my flashlight tightly, the beam cutting through the darkness in front of me. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, lying just off the path, was a set of footprints. They were small, dainty, clearly made by a woman. The prints were fresh, the edges still crisp in the dirt, as if they had been made only minutes before. I knelt down, examining the footprints more closely. They led off the trail, disappearing into the thick underbrush. My first thought was that a hiker had gotten lost, wandered off the path. But as I stood up and looked around, I realized something was wrong. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts telling me to turn back, to get out of the ravine and report the footprints to my supervisor. But something about the tracks drew me in, compelling me to follow them. I stepped off the trail, my heart racing as I pushed through the underbrush. The footprints led deeper into the forest, winding through the trees in a haphazard pattern. The further I went, the more uneasy I became. The air was growing colder, and the silence was deafening. After about 20 minutes of following the tracks, I came to a clearing. The trees opened up, revealing a small, grassy area bathed in the pale light of the moon. In the center of the clearing was a large boulder, and sitting on top of it was a woman. She was hunched over, her face hidden in her hands. Her hair was long and matted, and her clothes were torn and dirty. She looked like she had been out here for days, maybe even weeks. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you all right?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She just sat there, motionless, as if she hadn't heard me at all. I took another step forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and landing on her face. She was pale, deathly pale, and her eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. But there was something wrong with her eyes. They were cloudy, milky white, as if she were blind. Her mouth was hanging open slightly, and I could see her breath, cold and misty, hanging in the air in front of her. "Ma'am," I called out again, my voice trembling. "Do you need help?" Still, she didn't respond. I reached for my radio, my hands shaking as I tried to get a signal. But there was nothing, just static. I cursed under my breath, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave her out here, but something about her wasn't right. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder. But before I could, she looked up at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I saw something in them, something dark, something evil. And then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, unnatural, stretching across her face in a way that no human smile should. Her lips pulled back, revealing a row of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell? Before I could finish, she let out a low, guttural growl. It wasn't a sound a human should be able to make. It was deep, animalistic, and it sent a chill down my spine. I turned to run, but before I could move, she lunged at me. Her fingers were like claws, digging into my arm as she pulled me toward her. Her strength was unnatural, and no matter how hard I tried to pull away, I couldn't break free. She opened her mouth, her sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight, and I knew she was going to bite me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the pain. But it never came. Suddenly, the woman let out a scream, a high-pitched, ear-splitting scream that echoed through the forest. Her grip on my arm loosened, and I stumbled back, falling to the ground. I looked up, and she was gone. The clearing was empty, the boulder deserted. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart racing, my mind reeling. I didn't understand what had just happened. I didn't understand how she had disappeared, or where she had gone. All I knew was that I needed to get out of there. Fast. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking as I made my way back through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker than before. I could still hear the woman's scream echoing in my ears, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see her standing there, waiting for me. When I finally reached the trail, I didn't stop. I ran the whole way back to the ranger station, my breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time I got there, my legs felt like they were going to give out, and I collapsed onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? Instead, I handed in my resignation the next day and left Alaska for good. But even now, years later, I can still feel her cold fingers on my arm. I can still see her twisted smile, her sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. And sometimes when the wind is just right, I can still hear her scream. Story 3. The Vanishing of Lake Michigan. There's something about the Great Lakes that has always unsettled me. Maybe it's the sheer size of them, the way they stretch out toward the horizon, like a vast, endless ocean. Or maybe it's the stories, the tales of ships lost to the deep, of people who ventured out onto the water and never returned. Lake Michigan, in particular, holds a dark reputation, even among those who live near its shores. For years, locals have whispered about strange disappearances and mysterious creatures lurking beneath the surface. But there's one story that stands out above the rest, a story that has haunted the residents of a small town on the Wisconsin shore for generations, the story of the vanishing on Lake Michigan. It happened in the summer of 1967 in a town called Port Washington. Back then, Port Washington was a quiet place, a fishing community where everyone knew each other, and the biggest event of the year was the annual Lakefront Festival. People came from all over the state to fish, swim, and enjoy the beauty of Lake Michigan. But that summer, something happened that changed the town forever. I grew up hearing about it from my grandparents, who were teenagers at the time. They would tell me about the day it all started, about the family that vanished without a trace. The details varied depending on who was telling the story, but one thing was always clear: whatever happened on that lake wasn't normal. The family's name was the Markhams, Robert and Evelyn Markham, along with their 2 children, Emma and Tom. They were an ordinary family, well-liked in the community and known for their love of the water. Every summer, they would take their small boat out onto Lake Michigan for a day of fishing and swimming. They had done it countless times before, and there was no reason to believe that day would be any different. It was a bright, sunny morning when the Markhams set out from the dock. The lake was calm, the water a deep, clear blue. They waved to their neighbors as they sailed off, heading toward a small island about 10 miles from shore, a favorite spot for fishing. Several people saw them leave, and by all accounts, it was an ordinary day. But by the time evening came, the Markhams still hadn't returned. At first, no one was particularly worried. It wasn't uncommon for people to stay out on the lake a little longer than planned, especially when the weather was good. But as the sun began to set and the wind picked up, people started to grow concerned. Robert Markham was an experienced sailor, and he knew better than to stay out after dark, especially with his children on board. A search party was organized, made up of local fishermen and volunteers. They scoured the lake, calling out the Markhams' names and shining flashlights into the darkening water. But there was no sign of the family. No boat. No debris. Nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The search continued for days, with the Coast Guard eventually getting involved. Helicopters flew over the lake, scanning the surface for any trace of the boat. Divers were sent down to explore the depths, but they found nothing. It was as if the lake had swallowed the Markhams whole, leaving no trace behind. The town was in shock. People whispered about the curse of Lake Michigan, about the ships and planes that had disappeared over the years. Some said the lake was haunted, that the spirits of those who had drowned were still wandering beneath the surface, waiting to drag others down with them. Others believed there was something living in the depths, something that preyed on the unwary. But the strangest part of the whole story came weeks later, when the Coast Guard found something they couldn't explain. It was a clear, calm morning, not unlike the day the Markhams had disappeared. A small fishing boat, crewed by a few locals, was out on the water, about 5 miles from shore. The men were pulling up their nets when they spotted something floating in the distance. At first, they thought it was debris, a piece of wood, or a broken plank from an old shipwreck. But as they got closer, they realized it was something much more unusual. It was the Markhams' boat. The boat was in perfect condition, floating upright on the water, as if it had never been lost at all. But there was no one on board. No sign of the family. The engine was still intact, the fuel tank half full. The Markhams' fishing gear was neatly stowed, and the cooler was filled with untouched food and drinks. It was as if they had simply stepped off the boat and vanished. The Coast Guard towed the boat back to shore, where it was examined thoroughly. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that the boat had been damaged or capsized. The only thing out of place was a small, waterlogged notebook found in the cabin. The notebook belonged to Robert Markham. Inside there were several pages of handwritten notes, mostly about fishing and family outings. But toward the end of the notebook, the handwriting became frantic, the letters scrawled in uneven lines. "It's following us," one entry read. "I don't know what it is, but it's out there under the water. We tried to leave, but it won't let us. It's getting closer. I can feel it." Another entry, written in a shaky hand, simply said, "We can't escape." The final entry was just 2 words, scribbled so hastily that they were almost illegible. "It's here." The discovery of the notebook only deepened the mystery. What had the Markhams seen out on the lake? What had followed them? And how had they disappeared without a trace? The town was gripped by fear. People stopped going out on the lake, and those who did reported strange sightings, shadows moving beneath the surface, lights glowing in the water at night, and eerie sounds that echoed across the lake. Some said it was the ghost of the Markhams, trapped forever in the depths. Others believed there was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Years passed, and the story of the Markhams became a local legend. People still talked about the family that had vanished without a trace, but as time went on, the details became muddled, and the story became just another ghost tale to scare tourists. But the truth was far stranger than any of the rumors. I was working as a journalist in Milwaukee when I first heard the story. I had grown up in Wisconsin, but I had never paid much attention to the ghost stories that circulated around the Great Lakes. But when I heard about the vanishing on Lake Michigan, something about it stuck with me. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was real. A real family had disappeared, and their boat had been found floating on the lake, empty. I decided to do some digging. I spent months researching the case, talking to old-timers in Port Washington and scouring newspaper archives for any mention of the Markhams. Most people were reluctant to talk about it, some out of fear, others out of superstition. But the more I learned, the more I became convinced that there was something more to the story. The Markhams weren't the only ones who had disappeared on Lake Michigan. Over the years, there had been other reports of missing boats, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena. Some of the cases dated back over a century, but no one had ever found a definitive answer. I became obsessed with the story, determined to uncover the truth. I visited Port Washington, walking the same dock where the Markhams had set out on their fateful trip. The town had changed since then, but the lake remained the same, vast, cold, and unyielding. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I decided to rent a boat and head out onto the lake myself. I wanted to see if I could find anything, any clue that might explain what had happened. The locals thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I had come too far to turn back now. The water was calm as I set out, the boat cutting through the still surface of the lake. The sky above was a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I steered the boat toward the island where the Markhams had been heading the day they disappeared. As I approached the island, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to roll in from the east. It happened so suddenly that I barely had time to react. 1 minute, the water was clear and calm, and the next, I was surrounded by a dense, swirling mist. I slowed the boat, my heart racing. The fog was so thick that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The island had disappeared from view, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the hull. And then, from somewhere in the fog, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but as I listened, it grew louder. It was a woman's voice, calling out for help. "Please, someone, help me." I grabbed my flashlight, shining it into the fog. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the sound of the voice, growing more desperate. "Please." We're trapped. Help us." My blood ran cold. The voice sounded familiar, like I had heard it before. But that was impossible. I steered the boat toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog swirled around me, thick and impenetrable, but I kept moving forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog lifted. I was no longer alone on the water. Floating just a few yards away was the Markham's boat. It was exactly as it had been described upright, intact and completely deserted. But there was something else. Standing at the edge of the boat was a figure. It was a woman, her long hair hanging wet and matted over her face. She was wearing a tattered dress, and her arms were outstretched toward me. "Please, help us," she whispered. I froze, my hand tightening on the steering wheel. I knew who she was. I had seen her picture in the newspaper archives. It was Evelyn Markham. Before I could react, the woman let out a scream, a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that echoed across the water. I covered my ears, the sound so loud that it felt like it was piercing my skull. The fog closed in again, thicker than before. I couldn't see the Markham's boat anymore, but I could still hear the scream. Reverberating through the mist, I slammed the throttle forward, steering the boat away as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I didn't stop until I was back at the dock, my legs barely able to hold me up as I climbed out of the boat. I never went back to Lake Michigan after that. I never told anyone what I had seen either. Who would believe me? A journalist claiming to have seen the ghost of a woman who had disappeared decades earlier? It would ruin my career. But I know what I saw. I know the Markhams are still out there, trapped on that lake, waiting for someone to help them, and sometimes, when the wind is just right, I can still hear Evelyn Markham scream. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.